Not for a few years, not for a generation. For 400 years, there was no widely recognized prophetic voice in the tradition Israel had known. No one who stood up and said, "Thus says the Lord." No one who carried the weight of that ancient calling, the calling that had run unbroken from Moses, through Samuel, through Elijah, through Isaiah, through Jeremiah, all the way to the quiet and precise voice of this one man. And then, nothing. 400 years of nothing. That is longer than the United States has existed as a nation. Longer than the distance between the first pilgrims landing on American soil and the world you are living in tonight. Generation after generation of ordinary people trying to maintain an extraordinary faith in the silence left behind by the last voice they trusted. Tonight, we meet the man who spoke last. He did not call fire from heaven. He did not part a sea or raise the dead or stand before a king with a staff in his hand. He sat down with an exhausted people and asked them questions they did not want to answer. And then he made a promise that would take 4 centuries to keep. His name is Malachi, and before this night is over, you will understand why the silence he left behind was not the absence of God. Christians who came after him would look back across those 400 years and see something that the people living through them could not see from the inside. They would see preparation. They would see a story moving toward a moment. They would see the darkness before a particular and unrepeatable dawn. But you cannot understand the dawn without first sitting in the dark. So settle in. The fire is low. The night is quiet. And this is where the story begins. Chapter 1. The world Malachi walked into. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not come from suffering. It comes from something harder to name than suffering. It comes from having survived. From having been rescued and rebuilt and restored, and then waking up one morning to discover that the miracle you lived through has become ordinary. That the fire which once burned in your chest has settled into something quieter and colder. Not gone, exactly, but no longer warm enough to change anything. That is the world Malachi walked into. And to understand why that matters, we need to travel back to a moment that would have felt, to the people living through it, like the greatest reversal in the history of their nation. In the year 538 before Christ, something happened that no one in the ancient world could have predicted. Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, issued a decree. He told the Jewish people, who had been living in exile in Babylon for nearly 50 years, that they were free to go home, free to return to the land their ancestors had walked, to the city their fathers had built, to the ruins of the temple that had been the center of everything they believed about who they were and who God was. They went home. In waves, over decades, they returned. The temple was rebuilt and dedicated in the year 515 before Christ. Ezra came from Babylon carrying the law and a burning conviction that the people needed to return not just to the land, but to the God of the land. Nehemiah came and rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem in 52 days, which was the kind of thing that made even the enemies watching from outside stop and reconsider what they were dealing with. There were reforms. There were renewals. There were moments of genuine, collective, weeping repentance. The kind where entire communities stood in the open air and confessed and started over. And then the ordinary returned. This is the part of the story that no one likes to talk about, because it is the part that is most recognizable. The part where the extraordinary becomes routine, where the miracle of return becomes the daily inconvenience of living in a city that still needs so much work, where the rebuilt temple becomes just the building you walk past on your way to the market, where the God who brought your ancestors home through the wilderness becomes the God you remember to thank occasionally, if things are going well, and quietly blame when they are not. By the time Malachi appears, scholars estimate we are somewhere between 450 and 430 before Christ. Ezra's reforms are a generation old. Nehemiah's walls are standing, but his energy and authority are not what they were. And the community that had wept and promised to be different has largely, gradually, without any single dramatic decision, drifted back to something close to where it started. The priests are offering God their leftovers. Men are breaking their most intimate promises for more convenient arrangements. The tithes that were meant to sustain the community are going unpaid. And underneath all of the practical failures, there is a theological exhaustion that Malachi will name with a precision that is still startling when you read it. The people are saying, in words and in behavior, if not always out loud, what is the point? Now here is what makes Malachi unusual among all the prophets of Israel. He does not open with a vision of fire or a throne room or a valley of dry bones. He does not announce himself with the kind of imagery that signals something cosmic and overwhelming is about to happen. He opens with a conversation. The book of Malachi is structured as a series of disputes. God makes a statement. The people push back. God answers the pushback. This happens 6 times across 4 short chapters, and it gives the whole book the texture of an argument between people who know each other well enough to be genuinely angry with one another, which is, when you think about it, its own kind of intimacy. Scholars have long debated whether Malachi is even a proper name. In the Hebrew, the word is Malachi, which means my messenger or my angel. Some ancient interpreters believed this was not a personal name at all, but a title, a way of indicating that this message came through an anonymous servant. Others have argued, reasonably, that it is simply a name that happens to carry that meaning, the way parents in any language sometimes give their children names that are also words. The uncertainty is worth sitting with, because it tells us something about how this book wants to be read. We do not know this man's genealogy. We do not know his hometown. We do not know how old he was or how long he preached or whether anyone listened while he was alive. He appears in the text the way a voice in a dark room appears. You hear what is said. You feel the weight of it. But the person speaking is, in some essential way, secondary to the words. What we can reconstruct from the text and from the historical record is that this messenger was speaking to a community in a specific kind of pain. Not the pain of persecution, not the pain of foreign oppression, though that was part of the background. The pain of this community was the pain of people who had done everything right and found that everything right was not producing the result they had been promised. They had come home. They had rebuilt. They had reformed. They had repented. And the great restoration that the prophets before them had described with language full of glory and abundance and nations streaming to Jerusalem had not arrived. The land was still under Persian control. The Davidic king was not on the throne. The world looked, in most of the ways that mattered to ordinary people trying to feed their families, largely the same as it had before. And into that specific, complicated, understandable disappointment, Malachi brings his 6 disputes. He does not come with comfort first. He does not soften the opening. He starts with the most fundamental thing, because if that thing is not settled, nothing else can be. He starts with love. Think for a moment about what kind of messenger could have been sent to this community. A thundering prophet in the tradition of Elijah, calling for dramatic repentance. A visionary in the tradition of Ezekiel, showing images of future glory to lift their eyes. A poet like Isaiah, giving their pain language so beautiful it could hold the weight of centuries. Instead, God sends someone willing to have an argument. And the argument begins with the simplest and most destabilizing thing God could say to a people in this condition. I have loved you. That is where the book opens. And the response of the people is the response of someone who has been waiting a very long time and is no longer certain they believe what they are hearing. They say, how? That single, exhausted, honest syllable. How have you loved us? Show us. Because from where we are standing, the evidence is not clear. We will walk into that argument in the next chapter. But before we do sit for a moment in the world Malachi stepped into, the cracked streets of a city that is rebuilt but not restored, the temple that stands but no longer fills anyone with the feeling it once produced, the priests who are still performing the ceremonies but have stopped meaning them, the ordinary people who are still showing up but have begun asking, quietly, whether showing up is making any difference at all. This is not a world without religion. It is a world where religion has become a habit that has outlasted the conviction that gave birth to it. And into that world, a man whose name means my messenger stands up and opens his mouth. He is the last one who will speak for a very long time. Listen carefully to what he says. Chapter 2. I have loved you, when love is met with a question. There is a difference between someone who does not believe they are loved and someone who cannot feel it. The person who does not believe it has made a conclusion. They have weighed the evidence and arrived at a verdict. The argument with them is an argument about facts. But the person who cannot feel it is somewhere else entirely. They may know, in the part of them that holds information, that they are loved. They may even say the words back when asked. But the warmth that was supposed to accompany the knowledge has gone somewhere they cannot locate. And when you tell that person they are loved, the response is not denial. It is something quieter and more honest than denial. It is the question, where? This is where Malachi begins. And understanding what kind of people are asking that question changes everything about how the rest of the book sounds. God opens with 3 words. I have loved you. In the Hebrew it is even simpler than that. Ahavti etchem. I loved you. Not I have warm feelings toward you when you behave correctly. Not I will love you if you return to me. I loved you. With the full weight of what that word carries in the covenant tradition of Israel, the love of a parent for a child, the love that is not based on performance but on choosing, the kind of love that preceded you and will continue after you and is not contingent on what you do next. And the people say, how have you loved us? Now, there are ways of reading this exchange that make the people sound ungrateful, like children who have been given everything and cannot see it. And there are traditions of interpretation that read it exactly that way. But sit with it a little longer before deciding what kind of response it is. This community has been through something real. Their grandparents went into exile as a consequence of generations of unfaithfulness. Their parents came home with enormous hope and began the work of rebuilding everything that had been lost. And they themselves have lived in the rebuilt version, the version that was supposed to be the fulfillment, and found it smaller than the promise. The prophets before them had used language like this. The desert will blossom like a rose. The nations will come to Jerusalem. The glory of the Lord will fill the land. A king from the line of David will reign, and there will be no end to the increase of his government. And instead, a Persian governor. Modest harvests. A temple that is functional but not glorious. A community that is surviving but not flourishing. When the people ask, how have you loved us? They are not asking the question of people who have never believed. They are asking the question of people who believed deeply enough to come home from Babylon, who worked hard enough to rebuild the city, who tried faithfully enough to reform their practices, and who are now standing in the gap between the promise and the reality, asking the only honest question available to them. Show us, because we cannot see it from here. God's answer is unexpected. He does not point to the return from exile. He does not list the moments of mercy they may have forgotten. He points to Edom. Remember your brother Esau, he says. I have loved Jacob, but Esau I have hated. This answer has troubled readers across many centuries, and rightly so, because it is not the answer a person in pain wants to hear. When you are hurting and you ask someone whether they love you, the last thing you want is for them to start talking about someone else. But follow the argument carefully, because it is more precise than it first appears. It is worth noting that interpreters across different traditions have read this passage in genuinely different ways. Those in the Reformed theological tradition have often understood the language of love and hate here as pointing to divine election, the sovereign choosing of one people over another before either had done anything to deserve it. Others have read it as a reference to the historical fates of two nations rather than a statement about the eternal destiny of individuals. Still others see it as covenant language, where to love means to choose and commit and remain, and to hate means to step back from that commitment. The honest answer is that all of these readings have serious scholars and centuries of reflection behind them, and the full weight of what is being said here has been debated for a very long time. What all serious readings agree on is this: Esau is not just an individual in this text. He is the ancestor of Edom, and the history of Edom, by the time Malachi is writing, is the history of a nation that has made choices leading it, step by step, to desolation. The text says Edom's territory has been laid waste and given over to jackals of the wilderness. God is pointing to outcomes and asking the people to look at them honestly. Look at where your brother is. Look at where you are. You are still here. You still have the temple, the covenant, the promises. Your brother, who walked away from all of that, is in ruins. What you are experiencing as the absence of love may be the presence of a faithfulness that has not let you go even when you gave it every reason to. This is a hard argument to receive. It does not make the pain smaller. It does not explain why the promise feels so distant. It does not give the people what they are aching for, which is not a theological argument, but a felt experience of being held and seen and close to the God who claims to love them. But there is something honest in what God is doing here. He is refusing to let them define love purely by how it feels in a particular season. He is saying, the measure of whether you are loved is not whether everything is going the way you hoped. The measure is whether you have been abandoned. You have not been abandoned. That is not nothing. That is everything. Now the book does not let that be the end of the matter. Because God is not only making a case that he has loved Israel, he is also turning toward the people and beginning to show them what their response to that love has looked like in practice. And this is where the argument moves from the theological to the uncomfortably specific. The priests, the ones who are supposed to be closest to the sacred, the ones whose entire vocation is to maintain the space between the holy and the ordinary and help the people approach God in a way that is true and alive. They have begun to treat their role as a function rather than a calling. They are offering what is left over, what could not be sold, what no one else wanted. They are going through the forms of worship while their hearts are pointed elsewhere. And God uses an image that lands with the practical bluntness of someone who is done with polite language. Try offering that to your governor, he says. Try bringing your blemished animals to the Persian official who controls your food supply and your safety and watch his reaction. You already know he would not accept it. You would not dare insult him that way. And yet you bring it to me without hesitation. The contrast is not about the governor being more important than God. The contrast is about what the behavior reveals. The priests know which relationships require their best and which ones they can shortchange. And the fact that they are shortchanging God while giving their best to the governor tells you exactly where, in their actual daily experience, God ranks among the relationships that matter. This is not the anger of someone whose pride has been wounded. This is the grief of someone who can see that what is being offered as worship is not worship. It is performance. And performance, in the place where genuine encounter with a living God is supposed to happen, is not just inadequate. It is a kind of lie told to the most important person in the room. There is a Hebrew word that appears quietly in the first chapter of Malachi that most English translations render as contempt. But the Hebrew carries something more specific. It means to consider something common, to treat as ordinary what is supposed to be set apart, to handle with carelessness what deserves the fullest attention. The priests have stopped taking the sacred seriously. not through a single dramatic act of rebellion, through the slow accumulation of small carelessnesses that each seemed reasonable in the moment and collectively became something devastating. And underneath all of it, underneath the blemished offerings and the hollow ceremonies and the contempt dressed up as religion, there is the same question the people asked at the beginning. Is this real? Is anyone actually here? Does any of this matter? Malachi's answer, across 6 disputes and 1 short book, is the most important thing he has to say. Yes, it is real. Someone is here. And it matters more than you have been treating it as if it does. Come back, not with a better performance, with a real presence. He is worth it. Rest now. The argument has only just begun. Chapter 3. The Priests and the Art of Going Through the Motions. Picture a man in Jerusalem, sometime in the middle of the 5th century before Christ. He is a priest. He has been a priest his entire adult life, as his father was before him, as his grandfather was before that. He woke before dawn this morning, the way he always wakes before dawn. He dressed in the priestly garments. He walked to the temple through the familiar streets. He performed the morning sacrifice with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done the same thing 10,000 times. He is standing now at the altar, and his hands are moving through the ritual correctly, and his lips are forming the correct words, and everything visible about what he is doing looks exactly the way it is supposed to look. But somewhere between the 10th time he did this and the 1,000th time, something changed. Something interior and essential and very difficult to name went quiet. And the man standing at the altar now is performing, with great technical accuracy, the shell of something that used to be alive. He is not lying, exactly. He is not being deliberately dishonest. He is simply doing what he has always done in a way that has slowly, without his quite noticing when it happened, stopped meaning anything at all. This is the portrait Malachi paints in his 2nd dispute. And before it can land with the weight it deserves, we need to understand what the priests of ancient Israel were actually responsible for, because the failure Malachi describes is proportional to the role that was entrusted to them. The priesthood in Israel traced its origins to a man named Levi, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. The descendants of Levi were set apart from the other tribes for a specific purpose. While every other tribe received a portion of the land as inheritance, the Levites received no land at all. Their inheritance, in the language of the tradition, was the Lord himself, which is a way of saying that they were sustained entirely by the offerings and tithes the rest of Israel brought to the sanctuary. They lived, literally, from what the people gave to God. Within the Levites, the priests were a more specific subset, the descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother, authorized to perform the most sacred functions at the altar. They offered the sacrifices. They burned the incense. They maintained the lamp that was never supposed to go out. On the Day of Atonement, described in the 16th chapter of Leviticus, the high priest alone entered the most holy place, the inner room behind the curtain, and stood in the presence of God on behalf of the entire nation. In the theology of ancient Israel, what happened at the altar was understood to be real in the most consequential sense of that word. The atonement was real. The access to God that the priestly system provided was understood to be the difference between a people who could approach their God and a people who could not. And the priests were supposed to be more than technicians of the sacred. They were supposed to be teachers. The tradition describes the Levitical priests as responsible for instructing the people in the law, for preserving and transmitting the knowledge of God from one generation to the next. When someone in Israel had a question about what the law required, they went to a priest. The priests were, in the most comprehensive sense, the keepers of the connection between God and the people, which is why what Malachi describes is not a minor failure. It is a catastrophic one. He opens the 2nd dispute by invoking the covenant of Levi. He reminds the priests of what their role was designed to be, what the founding vision of the priesthood actually looked like. He says that the true priest who stands in that tradition was someone who walked with God in peace and uprightness. He turned many from sin. He gave true instruction. He stood in reverence before the one he served. And then Malachi says, with the directness of someone who has run out of gentler language, "You have turned aside from the way." Not, "Some of you have drifted a little." Not, "There are areas for growth." You have turned aside from the way. The specific charges are worth examining because they reveal what institutional religious decline actually looks like at ground level. The first charge is about instruction. The priests are causing people to stumble by their teaching. The failure is subtle. They are not necessarily teaching outright falsehood. The failure is that the instruction has become disconnected from the living reality of the God it is supposed to represent. Their teaching has become procedural. Here is what the law says. Here is the correct form of the ceremony. Here is what technically counts as compliance. But the heart of the thing, the actual encounter with a present God that all of the procedure was designed to make possible, has gone missing from the teaching. When the heart goes missing from religious instruction, what is left is a map without a destination. The second charge is about partiality. A priest who shows favoritism in the application of the law has corrupted the covenant. When the person who is supposed to administer the sacred things with equal care for everyone begins to calculate who is worth their full attention and who is not, the entire system is compromised. The poor person with a real question gets the abbreviated version. The influential family gets the full treatment. And the message that communicates, louder than any sermon, is that the God whose system this is supposed to be operates on the same terms as every other human system. He favors those with leverage. He does not. But you would not know it from watching the priests. Now here is what Malachi implies throughout this section without saying directly. These priests did not decide to become what they became. There was no morning when a priest woke up and said, "Today I begin corrupting the covenant." It happened the way most important failures happen. Slowly, through small decisions that each seemed reasonable in the moment. A slightly less thorough preparation for one ceremony because there was a great deal going on that week. A slightly more attentive response to the wealthy family because they were asking genuinely good questions and it was simply easier. A teaching that became more formulaic over time because the formula worked and creating something fresh every time was exhausting. And then one day, without any single decision having been made, the priest looks up and finds himself standing in the vocation exactly as we found him at the beginning of this chapter. Hands moving correctly. Lips forming the right words, everything visible looking exactly as it should, and nothing alive inside any of it. This is not a story about bad people. It is a story about the slow erosion of attentiveness, about what happens when the sacred becomes familiar, and familiarity is allowed to drift into carelessness without anyone noticing the transition. Malachi uses the language of waste to describe what God sees when he looks at these ceremonies. It is the strongest possible way of saying, what you are doing in my name is not what you think it is. I am not receiving what you believe you are offering. And yet even here, the conditional remains open. If you will not listen, if you will not take it to heart, then the curse comes. The if is still there. The possibility of turning back has not been closed. What God is doing with this hard language is not punishment. It is intervention. The kind a physician performs when the patient has been successfully ignoring the symptoms and the symptoms are getting worse. The harshness is not cruelty. It is the last available tool of someone who needs the other person to stop and actually pay attention. Take it to heart. That phrase appears more than once in the opening chapters of Malachi. To take something to heart is not the same as to understand it intellectually. To take something to heart means to let it reach the interior of you, the part that lives underneath the professional function and the social role and the habitual response. to let it disturb you where you actually live. The priests had become very skilled at processing information about God without letting that information reach the interior. They knew the law. They could recite the rituals. They could give you the theology. But somewhere along the way, the pipeline between what they knew and what they actually believed in the deep places had become blocked. What was passing through the blocked pipe looked like religion from the outside and felt like nothing from the inside. Malachi is not asking them to manufacture a feeling they do not have. He is asking them to stop, to sit with the discomfort of noticing what has happened, to take seriously, perhaps for the first time in a long time, the possibility that the God they are performing rituals for is actually present, actually watching, actually capable of being honored or dishonored by what they bring. Because if that is true, everything changes. The altar is not a stage. The ceremony is not a performance. And the God receiving it is not an audience that will applaud regardless of what is offered. He is present. He is real. There is one more thing in this section worth pausing on, because it runs against every instinct about how to survive a period of spiritual dryness. God says that true instruction should proceed from the priest's mouth, that people should be able to seek the knowledge of God from the lips of someone who has actually been near the fire, not from a document alone, not from a procedure, from a person who has spent enough time in genuine encounter with God that what comes out when they speak carries something of what they have experienced. This is a remarkable standard. It assumes that contact with God is real enough and regular enough and transformative enough that it actually changes the quality of what a person says. The priests have lost that contact. What comes out of their mouths now is truth without warmth, instruction without encounter, the correct words spoken by someone working entirely from memory. Malachi is asking them to go back to the fire, not to perform going back, not to simulate the warmth, to actually go, because what was real in the beginning is still real now. The fire has not gone out. The God who made the covenant with Levi is the same God speaking through Malachi in this moment. The access has not been revoked, but you have to actually show up to it, not as a function, not as a role, not as the man whose hands are moving correctly while his interior is somewhere else entirely. As a person who believes, in the place where believing actually happens, that what they are approaching is real. That is where Malachi leaves the priests. And it is the same place he leaves everyone who has ever gone through the motions of something that used to be alive. The fire is still burning. Go back to it. Chapter 4. Have we not all one Father? Faithfulness in the ordinary. Every great theological argument eventually lands somewhere unexpected. You expect it to stay in the realm of doctrine and ceremony. You expect it to operate at the level of institutions and the large movements of sacred history. And then suddenly it steps through a door, and you find yourself in the smallest possible space. Not a Templar, not a throne room, a home, a table, the face of someone who trusted you. That is what happens in the third dispute of Malachi. The subject changes. The stakes do not. We need the historical context before we can hear this correctly, because without it the passage sounds like something it is not. In the years following the return from Babylon, one of the most significant social pressures on the Jewish community was the pressure of assimilation. They were a small people in a large empire. The surrounding cultures were present, influential, and in many ways more prosperous and better connected than the returned exiles. Intermarriage with the surrounding peoples was not simply a romantic or personal matter. It was a complex social and economic reality with significant implications for property, family identity, and community cohesion. Ezra and Nehemiah had both dealt with this directly, and dealt with it in ways that modern readers often find difficult. There were painful separations. It was disruptive. It carried its own moral complexity. But underneath the social and political dimensions, Malachi is pointing to something more fundamental. He is pointing to what happens when a person makes a promise to another person and then, for reasons of convenience or social calculation, breaks it. He uses a word that appears only a handful of times in the Hebrew scriptures. The word is bagad. It means to act treacherously, to deal with someone in a way that violates the trust they placed in you. It is not a neutral word. It carries the full weight of what it means to be entrusted with something precious and to handle that entrusting carelessly. The specific situation Malachi is addressing is this. Men in the community are divorcing the women they married when they were young, women who are part of the covenant community, in order to take wives from surrounding cultures who offer better social positioning. The reasons are not difficult to imagine. Advancement, business connections, the practical calculus that always sounds reasonable from the inside and always looks like betrayal from the outside. Malachi makes an observation about these divorces that is unlike almost anything else in the prophetic tradition. He says that God was a witness to the covenant made between a man and the wife of his youth, not a distant observer. A witness, present at the moment of promise, invested in its keeping, aware of its breaking. Think about what that means. Every promise you have ever made to another person was made in the presence of the one who holds you to your word. Now I want to be careful here, because this passage has sometimes been used in ways that Malachi does not intend and that do real harm. This is not a passage about keeping people confined in dangerous situations in the name of covenant faithfulness. The specific failure Malachi is naming is a particular and recognizable one. The abandonment of a faithful person for someone more useful. The betrayal of vulnerability for the sake of opportunity. The principle underneath the specific situation is not that relationships never end. It is that the promises we make to other people are witnessed, and that breaking them because the calculation has changed is a form of the same faithlessness that corrupts everything else Malachi is describing. Before the specific accusation, Malachi opens with a question that frames everything that follows. Have we not all one Father? Has not one God created us? This is not a rhetorical flourish. It is the foundation of the charge. We are not strangers to each other. We are not competitors sharing a territory. We are members of a family. We were made by the same God. We share a common Father. And if that is true, then how we treat each other is not a matter of personal preference. It is a matter of what kind of children we are proving ourselves to be. The parent who sees one of their children treat another with betrayal does not simply feel sorry for the one who was wronged. They grieve the fracture in the family. They see in the betrayal something about the character of the one who betrayed. God sees the broken promises of Malachi's day that way. Now Malachi says something that has generated more discussion than almost any other line in the book. The Hebrew is complex enough that scholars across different traditions have translated and interpreted it in different ways. Some render it as God hates divorce. Others argue the text is better read as God hates the one who sends away treacherously, emphasizing the act of betrayal rather than the legal mechanism. Still, others focus on the Hebrew word that appears alongside a word for violence, suggesting that what God hates is the wound inflicted on the one who is abandoned rather than the legal act itself. What all serious readings share is this. God is not indifferent to what happens in the most intimate relationships of his people. He is present. He is watching. He cares about what happens to the person who trusted and was betrayed. That is not comfortable for someone who has broken a promise, but it is an enormously important word for someone who has been on the receiving end of one. If you have ever been the person left behind when you became inconvenient, Malachi has something specific to say to you tonight. God saw it. God was the witness to the covenant that was broken, and what was done to you was not invisible. Malachi then adds an observation that ties the personal back to the theological with a directness that is almost jarring. The prayers are not being answered. The offerings are going up and coming back down. The altar is covered with tears and weeping and groaning, and God is not responding with the favor the people are expecting. And the reason, Malachi says, is not mysterious. You are asking God to bless you from the altar while breaking the promises you made in front of that same altar to the person who trusted you most. The connection between what we do in the sacred space and what we do in the ordinary space of daily relationship is not a metaphor in Malachi. It is a structural reality. These things are joined. What you do at home with the person who trusts you most cannot be sealed off from what you experience in the place where you seek God. The altar knows what happened at the table. Guard yourself in your spirit. That phrase appears twice in this short section, not as a command to more religious activity, as an invitation to the kind of interior attentiveness that notices before the drift becomes irreversible, when faithfulness is starting to slip, when the calculation is beginning to feel more sophisticated than the promise, when the convenience of walking away has started to feel more real than the cost of that walking away to the person being left. Guard yourself before the small permissions stack on top of each other, before the rationalizations build into something that makes the betrayal feel like the only reasonable option, before the person who trusted you is standing in the gap between the promise and what you actually did, asking the same question that runs through the entire book of Malachi. How have you loved me? Show me, because I cannot see it from here. We are capable of making other people ask that question. We are also capable of deciding not to. The night is long. The argument is moving forward. And the place it moves toward next is more practical and more surprising than anything that has come before it. The question of what faithfulness looks like when it costs something real. Not at the altar. Not in the sacred space. In the most ordinary transaction of daily life. What you do with what you have. Chapter 5. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, the most misunderstood invitation in Malachi. There is a sentence in the book of Malachi that has been quoted from more pulpits, printed on more offering envelopes, and used in more fundraising appeals than almost any other sentence in the entire Hebrew scriptures. You have probably heard it. You may have grown up hearing it. You may have complicated feelings about it, depending on how it was used, and whether those feelings are warm or something closer to a quiet resistance you have never quite put into words. The sentence is this: Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. And thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open the windows of heaven for you, and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need. Before we can hear what this sentence actually means, we need to carefully look at what it has so often been made to mean, because the distance between those two things is significant. And closing that distance is the only way to let Malachi speak here with the honesty and the precision he brings to every other part of this argument. We begin where all good interpretation begins, with the world the words were spoken into. The tithe in ancient Israel was not primarily a financial transaction. This is the first and most important thing to understand. The economy of Israel in the 5th century before Christ was agricultural. The primary unit of wealth was not money but produce. Grain, wine, oil, livestock. The things the land produced when it was worked faithfully, and the rains came at the right times. The laws of Moses actually describe more than one form of tithe, and scholars of the Hebrew text have long distinguished between them. There was a tithe designated for the Levites, described in the book of Numbers, because the Levites had no land, and therefore no harvest of their own. There was a tithe brought to the central sanctuary for the great festival celebrations, described in the book of Deuteronomy, where the community would eat together before the Lord. And every 3rd year, there was a tithe designated specifically for the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner living among the people, also described in Deuteronomy. 3 distinct expressions of the same underlying principle. The produce of the land was not simply personal wealth. It was communal resource, and a portion of it belonged, by covenant obligation, to those who could not provide for themselves. When Malachi uses the word storehouse, he is pointing to the rooms built into the temple complex where this produce was collected and from which it was distributed. The storehouse was not a place where God kept his personal wealth. It was a community infrastructure, a food system, the mechanism by which the covenant community ensured that the people within it who could not provide for themselves were not abandoned. When the tithe was not brought, the storehouse was empty. And when the storehouse was empty, real people did not eat. Real Levites abandoned the temple and went looking for agricultural work because there was nothing for them in the place they were supposed to be. This is not speculation. The book of Nehemiah describes exactly this happening. Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem after a period of absence and finds the storerooms emptied and the Levites scattered. The house of God, he says, has been forsaken. That is the situation Malachi is addressing. Not a spiritual practice that has become casual. A community support system that has collapsed. Real people going without because the community has stopped honoring its obligations to its most vulnerable members. Now we can hear the accusation with its full weight. God says to the community, "You are robbing me." And the community responds, in the pattern that runs through the whole book, "How have we robbed you?" And the answer is, in your tithes and contributions. The whole nation has robbed me. The word used here carries the sense of defrauding, of taking what belongs to another by failing to give what was promised. And this raises a question worth asking directly. How does failing to bring your tithe constitute robbing God? The answer is in what the tithe was for. God did not need the grain. He did not consume the oil or drink the wine. The storehouse was not for him, in the sense that he would use it personally. The storehouse was for the people he had designated to care for, and the system he had established to sustain the community. When you failed to bring the tithe, you were not withholding something from an abstraction. You were withholding food from a Levite who had no other source of income. You were withholding sustenance from a widow who had no other safety net. You were failing specific, identifiable human beings who the covenant had promised would be cared for. And because God had identified himself with that system, to undermine the system was to rob him. This matters enormously for how we hear what comes next. Test me in this, God says. See if I will not open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing so large there will not be room enough to receive it. This invitation to test God is genuinely unusual in the biblical record. Throughout the scriptures, testing God is consistently presented as a form of faithlessness, a demand for proof that reveals a lack of trust. The Israelites in the wilderness tested God and were rebuked for it. And yet here, in Malachi, God himself extends the invitation. Why? Because the situation is not one of ordinary trust. The community has broken a specific, concrete, practical commitment and is experiencing specific, concrete, practical consequences. The harvests are failing. The crops are being lost. The land is not producing what it should. And the community is looking at these circumstances and concluding, as they have concluded everywhere else in the book, that God is absent or indifferent. God is saying, the connection between your breaking of the system and the system not working is not mysterious. Restore the commitment. Honor the covenant. And then see what happens. Test me. The invitation is not a promise that personal financial wealth will flow to individuals who give 10% of their income to a religious institution. This is the misreading that has done the most damage, and it deserves to be named clearly. Malachi is not addressing private financial transactions between individuals and organizations. He is addressing a covenantal community's collective failure to maintain a system designed to protect its most vulnerable members. The promise attached to the invitation is communal. The land producing, the system functioning as it was designed to function. The curse that came from covenant breaking being lifted when the covenant is honored again. The principle underneath the specific promise is real and worth taking seriously on its own terms. Communities that invest in the welfare of their most vulnerable members tend to be more resilient, more cohesive, and more capable of sustaining themselves over time. The covenant system of ancient Israel was not economically naive. It was a sophisticated social architecture designed to prevent the concentration of resources and the abandonment of the vulnerable that leads, in every human society, eventually to fracture. When the community funds the system works. When the system works, the community flourishes. But there is something else in this passage that goes beyond the economics and touches something deeper. The reason the people in Malachi's community are not bringing the tithe is not primarily financial. If it were simply that they could not afford it, the accusation of robbing would be unjust. The reason is that they have stopped believing it matters. They have stopped believing that the system works, that the God who established it is present and active, that what they contribute makes any real difference to anything. The failure to bring the tithe is a symptom of the deeper crisis that runs through the whole book. The same crisis that produces the question, "How have you loved us?" The same crisis that produces the hollow ceremonies and the empty instruction and the broken promises at the table. The crisis of people who have stopped believing in their bones that any of this is real. And God's response to that crisis is not a theological argument. It is an invitation to practical action. Stop thinking about it. Do it, and then look at what happens. This is a profoundly honest approach to the relationship between faith and action. Because God understands something about human beings that we sometimes forget about ourselves. We do not always think our way into new behaviors. Sometimes we have to act our way into new understanding. Sometimes the conviction does not come before the action. Sometimes it only comes after. Sometimes the only way to find out whether something is true is to act as if it is true and observe what follows. Test me. Not achieve certainty and then act. Act and then see. There is a freedom in this that is lost when this passage is reduced to a fundraising text. It is not primarily a demand. It is an invitation. God saying to a discouraged and skeptical community, "I know you have stopped believing. I know the faith has gone cold and the promises feel distant. But before you walk away entirely, try this one thing. Honor the commitment. Restore what was broken. And see what happens when the community starts functioning the way it was designed to function. The windows of heaven." In the agricultural imagination of the ancient world, this phrase pointed to the mechanism by which rain came. The heavens opened. The rain fell. The land produced. The harvest came in. The storehouse filled. The community was sustained. That is the promise. Not supernatural financial windfalls delivered to individual accounts. The ordinary miracle of a world working the way it was designed to work when the people in it treat each other the way the covenant calls them to. God adds that he will rebuke what the ancient text calls the devourer, the locusts and pests destroying the crops, so that the produce of the land would not be lost before it could reach the people who needed it. Their vines would not fail. The nations would call them blessed. Their land would be described as delightful. The visible, this world flourishing of a community that keeps its covenantal commitments, not a fantasy. The actual material world, working the way it is supposed to work, when the people in it are treating each other the way they are supposed to treat each other. A community where the Levites are in the temple, teaching because the storerooms are full enough to sustain them. Where the widows are eating because the community honored its obligation to provide for them. Where the land is producing because the system God established for its care is being honored. Where the nations look at this community and notice something different. That is the vision Malachi holds out. Not individual wealth. Community health. And the door to that vision is not a theological breakthrough or a moment of spiritual intensity. It is a practical act of bringing what you owe to the system that sustains the people you belong to. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, not because God needs it, because your neighbor does. And because what you do with what you have is always, in the end, the truest indicator of what you actually believe about the God you claim to serve. Test me in this, says the Lord. He is still saying it. The storehouse is still waiting. And so are the people whose names you will never know, living on the edges of your community, hoping that someone who has more than enough will remember that the covenant was never only about them. Chapter 6. The people who said it was useless, a portrait of holy exhaustion. There is a woman in Jerusalem, sometime in the middle of the 5th century before Christ. She has been faithful her entire adult life. She rises before her household each morning and goes through the day with the kind of quiet discipline that no one notices because it has never once faltered. She keeps the Sabbath. She brings what she owes to the temple. She teaches her children the stories her mother taught her. She does the things, all of them, every day, without fanfare and without reward and without much visible sign that any of it is making any difference to anything at all. And on a particular evening, sitting by the lamp after the children are asleep, she allows herself to think the thought she has been pushing down for a long time. It is not working. Not, I no longer believe. Not, I am walking away. Something more painful than either of those things, because it is the thought of someone who has not walked away and does not intend to, and is sitting in the middle of all the evidence that the faithfulness is costing her something real, while the people who are not faithful seem to be paying nothing at all. It is not working. She does not say this out loud. Not to her husband. Not to anyone at the temple, but she thinks it in the lamplight, in the quiet after the children are asleep, and the thought has the texture of a stone settling somewhere inside her that she does not know how to lift. This is the person Malachi is writing for in the 5th dispute. And what gets said in this dispute is so honest, so raw, and so recognizable to anyone who has ever sat in the lamplight with that particular stone in their chest, that it deserves more careful attention than it usually receives. The community speaks, and what they say is not a declaration of atheism. It is not a formal renunciation of the covenant. It is something harder to dismiss than either of those things. It is the testimony of people who tried. They say, it is vain to serve God. What is the profit of our keeping his charge or of walking in mourning before the Lord of hosts? And now we call the arrogant blessed. Evildoers not only prosper, but they put God to the test and they escape. Let those words sit for a moment before you move past them. It is vain to serve God. Not, God does not exist. They are not making a philosophical claim about the reality of a divine being. They are making a relational claim about the value of the relationship. We have been in this relationship. We have kept the obligations. We have walked in mourning, which in the ancient world was a posture of deliberate humility, sackcloth and ashes, and the conscious positioning of oneself before God as someone who is aware of their smallness and their need. We have done the things, and the things have not produced what the things were supposed to produce. And meanwhile, the people who are not doing the things seem to be doing fine. The arrogant ones, the ones who are not keeping the charge, the ones who are living without reference to the requirements of the covenant and treating the promises as if they do not apply to them. Those people appear to be flourishing. This is one of the oldest and most persistent challenges to faith. It has a formal name in the theological tradition, theodicy, the question of why the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer. But Malachi is not presenting it as an intellectual puzzle to be solved in a classroom. He is presenting it as a lived experience, as the thought of a woman by a lamp at the end of a long day of faithful, invisible, unrewarded effort. It is not working. No. What is important to notice before we hear the response is this. The people who are saying it is vain to serve God are not, In the context of this book, the corrupt priests, or the faithless husbands, or the people who have been withholding the tithe, they appear to be the group that has actually been trying. The ones who took the covenant seriously enough to feel the sting of its apparent ineffectiveness. The ones who are not complaining from a position of comfortable distance, but from the exhausted interior of genuine effort. You cannot feel cheated by something you never invested in. The depth of the disappointment tells you the depth of the investment. And this matters enormously, because the response that comes to this complaint is not a rebuke. It is not a correction. It is not a command to try harder or believe more or stop asking the question. It is a disclosure. God tells Malachi that the people who fear the Lord, who speak to one another about what they are carrying, are being heard. Their words are not disappearing into silence. They are being listened to. And more than that, a book of remembrance is being written before God for those who fear him and esteem his name. A book of remembrance. In the royal courts of the ancient Near East, records were kept. Lists of people who had served faithfully, people who had performed acts of loyalty and courage and quiet faithfulness that deserved to be preserved in the official memory of the reign. To be written in the king's record was to be recognized, to be seen, to be held in a relationship with the crown that persisted even when the individual act of faithfulness was long past and unwitnessed by anyone still living. God is saying, I have a record. And the people who fear my name, who have not given up on the relationship despite the difficulty of the season, who are speaking honestly to one another in the dark, those people are in it. They shall be mine, God says. They shall be my treasured possession on the day when I act, and I will spare them as a man spares his son who serves him. My treasured possession. The Hebrew word is segula. It appears several times in the Torah to describe Israel's relationship with God. You shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. It is the word for the thing you would not trade away for anything. The thing you keep not because it is useful, but because it is yours, and you love it. Not a possession in the sense of property, a possession in the sense of something held close, something protected, something valued beyond its function. God uses this word for the people who have been faithfully, quietly, unspectacularly trying to maintain their faith in a season when maintaining faith does not seem to be paying off. The woman by the lamp. She is not invisible. She is not forgotten. She is written down. Now I want to stay with something in this passage that is easy to read past because it seems like a small detail. But it is one of the most important things in the entire book. The text says that those who feared the Lord spoke to one another, not that they maintained their private interior devotion in isolation, not that they each went away separately and kept the faith in the privacy of their own hearts. They spoke to one another. They gathered. They sat together in the difficulty and said honest things to each other. They named what they were experiencing and held it in common. In a community where the official channels of religious life have become hollow, where the public worship has become performance, the people who are still genuinely trying are finding each other. And they are doing something simple. They are talking, not organizing, not producing, not performing a more authentic version of the religion for an audience, just speaking honestly with one another about the God they are having trouble finding, and the faith they are having trouble sustaining, and the reality they are trying to hold on to, even as it keeps slipping through their hands. And that, according to Malachi, is the thing God is listening to most closely. Not the official ceremonies, not the technically correct offerings, not the institutional performance of religion at its most polished. The honest conversations happening between ordinary people who are struggling and who have found each other in the struggle and who are choosing to sit together rather than drift apart. There is a community of that kind in every generation. It is not always visible. It is rarely the most prominent expression of faith in any era, but it is there. And Malachi says it is precisely there that God is paying the closest attention. You are not the last one. That is the message underneath the message of this fifth dispute. You feel alone in your faithfulness. You feel like the only person still trying when trying does not seem to produce results. You feel like the people who have given up are, from a purely practical standpoint, making the more rational choice. You are not the last one. There are others. They are speaking to each other, and the things they are saying, in the conversations that no public record would think to preserve, are being written down in a book that God himself is keeping. The woman by the lamp is not the only one sitting with that stone in her chest tonight. There are others, in other houses, in other villages, with other lamps burning low, all of them written down. Do not give up before the morning. Now Malachi turns toward the other group, the ones he calls the arrogant, the ones who have seemed to prosper while the faithful have struggled. And what he says is not triumphalist. It is not the voice of someone who takes pleasure in announcing judgment. It is the voice of someone who wants the distinction between these two ways of living to be seen clearly, because the clarity matters. Then you will again see the distinction between the righteous and the wicked, between one who serves God and one who does not. Again, that word is doing something important. There was a time when the distinction was visible, when it was possible to look at the world and see that faithfulness led somewhere genuinely different from faithlessness. That time has felt, in the difficult season Malachi is addressing, like it has ended. The distinction has blurred. The outcomes appear indistinguishable. Not forever, God says. Not at the end of the story. But Malachi does not let the people wait for that future clarity as a reason to disengage from the present. He does something more pastoral than that. He gives them the frame they need to live faithfully in the meantime. The meantime, that in-between space where the promises have not yet been fulfilled and the difficulty has not yet resolved, and the distinction between faithfulness and faithlessness is not yet visible to anyone watching. The space where most of us spend most of our actual lives of faith. How do you live there without losing yourself? You find the people who fear the Lord. You speak to them honestly. You let the record of your honest conversation be written somewhere you cannot see. You hold on to the word segula, treasured possession, not useful instrument, not impressive performer, treasured possession. And you do not let the apparent prosperity of those who have given up become the measure of whether faithfulness is worth it. Because the measure of whether faithfulness is worth it is not visible yet. But it is coming. And the chapter that follows holds a picture of what the morning looks like when it finally arrives. A picture so vivid and so particular that it has never been forgotten by anyone who has truly let it land. You are not the last one. You are known. You are written down. Chapter 7. The day that burns and the sun that heals, two faces of the same morning. There is a moment in every long night when the darkness reaches its deepest point. Not at the beginning of the night, when you still carry some warmth from the day that just ended. Not in the middle, when sleep can still find you. But in the hours before dawn, when the body is coldest and the mind is most exposed, and the distance between where you are and where the light is feels impossible to cross. Malachi is writing for people in that hour. And what he says in the fourth and final chapter of his book is not a gentle reassurance designed to make the remaining darkness feel less dark. It is something stranger and more powerful than reassurance. It is a vision. And like all true visions, it contains within it something that cuts and something that heals, and the same image does both things depending on where you are standing when it arrives. He begins with fire. Surely the day is coming, he says. It burns like an oven. All the arrogant and every evildoer will be stubble. The day that is coming will set them ablaze, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. This is not comfortable language. It is not designed to be. But before we hear what it means, we need to be clear about what it does not mean, because the history of reading this passage contains misreadings that have done real damage. The fire, in the prophetic tradition of Israel, is not primarily an image of endless punishment in the way that some later theological traditions have interpreted it. It is, in its original context, the image of the burning away of what is false so that what is true can remain. The complete consumption of everything built on a foundation that cannot hold. Think of it this way. Every arrangement of arrogance, every structure that has sustained itself by treating the vulnerable as expendable and the covenant as optional, every system held together by the assumption that power is the final reality and that the God who makes promises to the poor and the widow is either absent or irrelevant. Every one of those systems is built on a particular understanding of how the world ultimately works. The day Malachi describes is the day when that understanding meets what is actually true, and what is built on something false cannot survive that meeting. Root and branch. Nothing left to sustain it. Not because God is vengeful, but because what was never real cannot persist when reality arrives in its fullness. That is the fire. And now, without pause, without transition, Malachi turns to the other image. But for you who fear my name, the Sun of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings. For you, two words that change everything that came before them. The same day, the same dawn, the same arrival of ultimate truth into the world. But for the people who have feared the name of God, who have spoken to one another in the dark, who are written in the book of remembrance, for those people that day does not arrive as destruction. It arrives as sunrise, the Sun of Righteousness. This phrase appears only once as a specific combination in the entire Hebrew Bible. And it is worth noting that while this particular phrase is unique to Malachi, the deeper imagery it draws from, the connection between the sun, divine justice, and the character of God, runs through the Psalms and the prophetic writings in ways that would have resonated immediately with Malachi's original audience. When the psalmist writes that the Lord God is a sun and shield, or when Isaiah describes a day when the light will be sevenfold, they are drawing from the same reservoir of imagery that Malachi brings to its most concentrated expression here. In the ancient world, the sun was frequently associated with justice. The great law codes of the ancient Near East depicted rulers receiving their authority in the presence of the solar deity, because the sun was understood to be the source of the light by which truth could be seen clearly, by which the false could be distinguished from the true, by which justice could be carried out with accuracy. Malachi takes that ancient image and transforms it. The sun that rises is not the sun of any foreign court or borrowed mythology. It is the sun of righteousness itself. The rising of a reality so aligned with truth and justice and the character of the God who made the covenant that it functions for the faithful the way the winter sun functions for the cold earth. It does not destroy. It restores. It warms what has gone cold. It brings back to life what the long season has left dormant. And it rises with healing in its wings. The Hebrew word for wings here is kanaf. It also means the corner or edge of a garment. It is the same word used when Ruth asks Boaz to spread his garment over her as an act of covenant protection. It is the word used in the Psalms when the writer describes taking refuge under the shadow of God's wings. It is a word of covering, of shelter, of the protection that comes when something larger positions itself between you and what threatens you. The sun of righteousness rises, and it does not simply shine on the faithful from a distance. It covers them, it enfolds them, and it brings with it, in the very structure of its arrival, the healing that the long night has made necessary. Healing, not simply restoration to what existed before the night. Healing implies that something was wounded, that the waiting was not painless, that the faithfulness cost something real, that the people receiving this sunrise are not people who move through the darkness untouched, but people who carry the marks of it. The woman by the lamp carries those marks. The man at the altar who wants to mean what he is doing but keeps finding that the wanting is not enough. The family that has been trying and not prospering, while the family down the road that stopped trying seems to have everything. Every one of them carries the marks of the night. God does not promise his people a painless passage through the night. He promises them a sunrise. And you shall go out leaping like calves from the stall. This image is so unexpectedly physical and specific and joyful that it almost seems out of place in a book that has been conducting serious theological disputes. But it is exactly right. A calf that has been kept through the cold months, fed and sheltered but confined, released into an open field on the first warm morning of spring, does not walk out sedately. It does not emerge with the measured dignity of someone who has carefully considered the theological implications of the new season. It runs. It kicks. It leaps. It moves with the completely unself-conscious physical joy of a creature that has been enclosed and is suddenly, gloriously, undeniably free. That is what God says the arrival of the Son of Righteousness will feel like for the people who have been waiting through the night. Not dignified, not measured, not theological, free. Now Malachi adds two commands that follow the vision. They come after the fire and the sunrise and the leaping calves, after the most vivid imagery in the entire book, and their placement is deliberate. The first command is this: remember the law of my servant Moses. The statutes and rules commanded at Horeb for all Israel. Remember. Not seek a new revelation. Not wait for a fresh word. Remember what you already have. In seasons of spiritual disappointment, there is a persistent temptation to conclude that the problem is insufficient revelation. That if God would just say something new, provide some additional clarity, send some unmistakable sign, then the faith would be easier to maintain. Malachi refuses that logic with a single word. Remember, you have the law of Moses. You have the covenant. You have everything you need to live faithfully in the present. The problem is not that you have been given too little. The problem is insufficient attention to what is already in your hands. The ancient wisdom does not become less wise because it is ancient. The covenant does not become less binding because it was given a long time ago. The law of Moses was not given for the generation that received it at Horeb. It was given for all Israel, every generation that comes after, including the generation standing in the rubble of the Second Temple wondering what comes next, including the person listening to these words tonight, in whatever difficulty they are sitting in. The second command follows immediately, and it closes not only the book of Malachi but the entire collection of the Hebrew prophets. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers. We will walk carefully into what this promise means in the chapters that follow. But for now, sit with what Malachi has just done. He has given his community a vision of fire and sunrise. He has given them the command to remember what they already hold. And then he has given them a promise. Before the great day comes, something will happen. Someone will come. The fractures between generations will be addressed. Fathers and children drifting in opposite directions will find their way back to each other. And then, on that note of promise still hanging in the air, the voice falls silent. Not because it has said everything, because it has said enough. Enough to sustain a people through what comes next. But what comes next is longer than anyone standing in Malachi's day could have anticipated. The Son of Righteousness will rise, with healing in its wings, and you will go out leaping. Hold that picture with you into the night. Let it sit somewhere in you where the arguments cannot reach it. Let it do its work while you sleep, because the morning it describes is real, and it is coming. Chapter 8. 400 years. The shape of the silence. Imagine receiving a letter, not a message on a screen. A letter written by hand, by someone who has known you long enough to see you at your best and at your worst, and who has not stopped caring about you despite the full knowledge of both. You read it slowly. You feel the weight of it. You sit with the final sentence for a long time after you have finished. And then the letter ends. And there is no next letter. Not for a week. Not for a month. Not for a year. The silence stretches out in a way you did not expect and cannot fully prepare for, because you were not told how long it would be. Only that it would eventually end. Only that someone was coming. Only that before the great and awesome day arrived, there would be a voice, but the voice does not come. Not in this generation. Not in the next. Not in the lifetimes of the children who were read the letter, or the grandchildren who were told about it, or the great-grandchildren for whom it had become tradition rather than living memory. This was the situation that Malachi's closing words created for the community that received them. To walk honestly through those 400 years, we need to look at what was happening in the visible world during all of that time. Because the silence did not occur in a historical vacuum. It occurred in the middle of one of the most turbulent periods in Jewish history. And the people living through it had no map. They could not see from the inside what the silence was moving toward. They could only feel how long it was. When Malachi finished speaking, the Persian Empire still controlled the land of Israel. That empire had been, on balance, relatively tolerant of Jewish religious practice. Cyrus had issued the decree of return. Later Persian rulers had supported the missions of Ezra and Nehemiah. The community had struggled, but it had struggled with the freedom to maintain its covenant identity, to practice the law of Moses, to operate the temple in Jerusalem. Then, in the year 333 before Christ, everything shifted. A young Macedonian king swept through the Persian Empire with a speed and completeness that astonished the ancient world. Within a decade, Alexander had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to the borders of India. And with his military victories came something historians consider more transformative than any battle: the deliberate spread of Greek culture, language, and ways of thinking into every territory he touched. This process is called Hellenization, and for the Jewish community, it was an existential challenge unlike anything that had come before it. The Persians had conquered them politically, while largely leaving their culture intact. The Greeks offered something more subtle and in some ways more dangerous. They offered an alternative that was genuinely attractive. The Greek world was sophisticated and educated and cosmopolitan. It had philosophy and theatre and a way of organizing public life that seemed, to many Jewish people, particularly the wealthy and educated, more advanced than the ancient covenant traditions of their fathers. The pressure to assimilate was not primarily external, in the way that persecution is external. It was internal. The pressure that comes when the world around you is offering something that looks, in almost every practical dimension, more functional and more desirable than what you have. When your children come home asking questions about Plato and wondering why the old ways matter to people who seem to have moved beyond such things. Different segments of the community responded in different ways. Some embraced Hellenization. Some resisted it completely. Many navigated a complicated middle path that satisfied no one fully and cost them peace in both directions. Then, in the year 167 before Christ, something happened that pushed the tension past the point of navigation. A Greek ruler named Antiochus IV, who called himself Epiphanes, meaning the God manifest, but whom his opponents called by a different name, meaning the madman, decided to resolve the problem by eliminating Jewish practice entirely. He prohibited the observance of the Sabbath. He outlawed circumcision. He burned copies of the Torah. And in the act that would burn itself into Jewish memory more deeply than any other, he entered the temple in Jerusalem and desecrated the most holy space the community knew. This led to a revolt. A priestly family called the Maccabees led a campaign against the Greek forces that succeeded, against overwhelming odds, in driving them from Jerusalem. They recaptured the temple, cleansed it, and rededicated it to the worship of God. This rededication is commemorated to this day in the festival of Hanukkah, which means dedication. The Maccabean period produced its own heroes and its own theology of faithful resistance. And then it produced its own corruption, as the family that had been heroic priests gradually became something closer to a dynastic monarchy, with all the attendant compromises that accompany the transformation of idealism into institution. And then came Rome. In the year 63 before Christ, the Roman general Pompey entered Jerusalem and made his way into the temple complex. Roman control of the region was now established, and the final stretch of the silence would play out under the weight of an empire that demanded, above all else, the acknowledgement of Roman authority. Now, I want to be precise here, because precision matters. What is often called the 400 years of silence refers, in the Christian theological tradition, to the absence of a prophetic voice in the tradition of the Hebrew canonical prophets. It is important to acknowledge that Jewish communities in this period were not without religious life, spiritual reflection, or sacred literature. There were apocalyptic writings, wisdom texts, and documents like the books of Maccabees that recorded and interpreted the events of those turbulent centuries. The silence that Christians later came to describe was the silence of a specific kind of prophetic voice, the voice that had spoken in the name of the Lord with the authority of Moses and Elijah and Isaiah and Jeremiah, the voice that Malachi had embodied one final time. And that voice had not been heard. Think of the woman by the lamp from the previous chapter. Now imagine her granddaughter, and her granddaughter's children, each of them inheriting the same quiet faithfulness, the same practices, the same stories told at the same tables, the same hope held across the same gap between the promise and the visible reality. Each of them asking, in their own generation, in their own lamplight, the same question: is anyone still there? 400 years of that question. 400 years of ordinary people getting up in the morning and making the choice, again, to continue. And then, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, while Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, in the specific historical moment that the Gospel of Luke describes, with the precision of someone establishing the date of something that actually happened, a man appeared. Not in Jerusalem, not in the temple, not at the center of the institutional religious life of his community. In the wilderness, he wore clothing made of camel's hair. He had a leather belt around his waist. He ate locusts and wild honey. If you have been paying attention, those details are not incidental. They are a signal. The specific description the tradition had always associated with one particular figure, the rough man from the wilderness, the one who appears without genealogy, without institutional credentials, without the ordinary markers of social legitimacy, the one who simply shows up and says the thing that changes everything. His name was John, and he came preaching in the wilderness of Judea, calling people to prepare, saying that the kingdom of heaven was near. The Gospel of Matthew connects him explicitly to the ancient prophetic tradition, to the voice crying in the wilderness from the book of Isaiah. And when the disciples of Jesus asked him directly whether Elijah must come first, Jesus gave an answer that the tradition had not entirely prepared for, but that made complete sense once it was given. He told them that Elijah had already come, and they had not recognized him. Christians who came after understood this to mean that John had come in the spirit and power of Elijah, fulfilling the promise of Malachi not through a supernatural reappearance of the ancient prophet, but through a man formed by the same wilderness, carrying the same fire, saying the same essential thing that Elijah had said in a different century. How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. Prepare the way of the Lord. The promise of Malachi had been kept, but it had been kept in a form that required the eyes of faith to see. The voice that broke the silence was not what anyone had drawn in their imagination. It was a man in the wilderness, wearing camel's hair, asking the same question Malachi had been asking all along. Are you ready? Because something is coming that is larger than anything that has come before. Christians, looking back across those 400 years, would later come to see the silence not as absence, but as preparation. As the long inhale before the word was spoken again, this time not through a prophet, but as something the tradition had not had adequate categories for in advance. But you cannot understand what broke the silence without first understanding how long the silence was. And now you do. The storehouse was empty. The priests were performing without believing. The people were asking whether any of it was worth it. And 400 years of ordinary people were getting up in the morning and choosing to continue. Their faithfulness was not wasted. Nothing written in that book was wasted. And the morning that finally came was worth every year of the waiting. Chapter 9. One family in the silence. What it costs to keep hoping. In Jewish tradition, the hope that Malachi's final promise kept alive across the centuries came to be expressed in a practice that is still observed at Passover tables around the world. A cup of wine is poured. An extra cup, more than the number of people at the table requires. It is set in the center where everyone can see it. And near the end of the meal, the door of the house is opened. The family looks out into the night. They are looking for Elijah. The cup bears his name. The door is opened for him. The tradition holds that the great prophet, who never died in the ordinary way but was taken up in the whirlwind, might come on the night of Passover, and his arrival would signal that the great and awesome day of the Lord was near, that the promise Malachi had spoken was finally, at last, being kept. I want you to sit with this practice for a moment. Not as a piece of religious trivia, but as a window into something deeply human about how faith survives a long silence. Every year, the cup is poured. Every year, the door is opened. Every year, the family looks out into the darkness of whatever lane or street or alley their house opens onto. Every year, there is nothing there. And every year, the door is closed again, the meal is finished, and the family goes to bed. And then, the next year, the cup is poured again. Now I want to follow one particular family through one particular Passover evening, sometime in the 2nd century before Christ, in a village in Judea, during the years of Maccabean revolt and Greek cultural pressure, and all the accumulated difficulty of a community trying to remain itself in a world designed to make remaining itself as inconvenient as possible. The father has lit the lamp. The mother has prepared the bread without leaven. The youngest child has asked the question that begins the ceremony, the ancient question that every child is taught to ask: why is this night different from all other nights? And the father has told the story. Egypt, and the plagues, and the blood on the doorposts, and the parting of the sea, and the bread from heaven in the wilderness, and the law given at the mountain. The story the family has told every year at this table for as long as anyone can remember, and before that, for as long as anyone has been told about. The children have eaten. The songs have been sung. The cups appropriate to the ceremony have been shared. And now the father rises from the table. He takes a cup and fills it with wine. He places it in the center of the table. He walks to the door and opens it. The night air comes in. The child, sitting nearest to the door, feels it on their face. Cool and dark and smelling of the village at night, of cook fires and animals, and the particular smell of the air in this particular place, in this particular season. The family looks past the doorframe into the lane outside. There is no one there. Just the dark and the quiet and the distant sound of another family inside their own home, doing what families do at the end of the evening. The father stands at the open door for a moment. The child watches his face. There is something in the way he is standing, something in the quality of his looking that is not just going through the motions. He is actually looking, As if, even after all the years of opening this door and seeing nothing, he has not quite stopped expecting that this might be the year. He closes the door. He returns to the table. The cup of wine remains in the center, full and untouched. "Why?" the child asks. "Who was the cup for?" "For Elijah," the father says. "We leave a place for him. We open the door. We wait." "But he did not come," the child says. "No," the father says. "Not yet. Not yet." Those two words. Sitting quietly in the middle of a kitchen in a village in Judea, in the middle of 400 years of silence, in the mouth of a man who has opened that door more times than he can count and seen nothing more than the familiar dark of the familiar lane. Not yet. This is the practice that carried the hope of Malachi forward through the centuries. And what it represents is worth staying with, because it is one of the most quietly extraordinary things that human beings do in the face of a long, unanswered promise. The cup is poured not because the family is certain, not because the evidence is unambiguous, not because the waiting has been short or the faith has been easy, or the promise has shown any visible signs of being kept in the form that was expected. The cup is poured because pouring it is what faithfulness looks like when the promise is all you have. It is the physical act of saying, "I still believe you are coming. I do not know when. I do not know what form it will take. I have opened this door more times than I can count. But I am pouring the cup anyway. I am opening the door anyway. I am teaching my children to ask about it anyway. Not yet is not the same as never. I want to stay in this kitchen a little longer, because there is something here that the more formal theological discussions of this period often miss. The people who maintained Jewish faith and practice and covenant identity through those 400 years were not, for the most part, extraordinary individuals performing dramatic acts of heroic faith. They were ordinary families sitting around tables in ordinary villages, telling a story they had inherited, performing practices whose origin reached back further than anyone in the room could personally remember, maintaining a way of life in the middle of cultural pressure and political occupation and the grinding ordinary difficulty of simply keeping a household alive and a community coherent. They were not doing it because the evidence was unambiguous. They were doing it because the story was true, and the practices were theirs, and the cup belonged on the table, even when the one it was poured for had not come. This is the kind of faith that Malachi was writing for. Not the faith of the mountaintop experience, though that faith has its place. Not the faith of the dramatic moment when fire falls from heaven, or a sea parts, or a voice speaks from a burning bush. The faith of the table. The faith of the annual repetition of a story that is old enough to have been doubted 1,000 times and true enough to have survived every doubt. The faith of the cup poured for someone who has not yet arrived, but who was promised and whose promise has not been revoked. There is something in this that speaks directly to the specific kind of spiritual difficulty that the most serious and honest people in any generation tend to experience. It is easy to maintain faith when the evidence is clear, when the prayers are being answered with the kind of specificity that leaves no room for coincidence, when the community is alive and the worship is genuine, and the sense of divine presence is available and real. It is something else entirely to maintain faith in the gap. In the years between the last clear experience of the divine and the next one, in the season when the practices feel routine and the prayers feel like they are landing on a ceiling and the community around you is going through motions and you are not entirely sure you are not doing the same. In that season, the cup on the table is not a small thing. It is everything. It is the decision, made again each year, to continue treating the promise as real even when the promise has not yet been kept in the form you expected. It is the refusal to let the length of the waiting become the definition of the relationship. It is the acknowledgement that the God who was present in the past is not required to announce himself in every present moment in order to remain real. The cup on the table says, "I believe you are coming. I do not know when. I do not know what you will look like when you arrive. I have opened this door more times than I can count, but the cup is poured. The door is open, and I am still at the table. That kind of faith is one of the most active and costly things a human being can do, because every year that the door is opened and closed again, without the expected arrival, is a year in which the choice to pour the cup again must be made against the accumulated weight of every previous unopened door. And yet the cup was poured, year after year, family after family, generation after generation, by people whose names we do not know, in villages whose locations we cannot locate, in the middle of circumstances that gave them every practical reason to stop. They did not stop. Now there is something else worth naming about what those 400 years required of the people who lived through them, something beyond the endurance of a long wait. Because it was not only the length of the waiting that was difficult, it was the form the keeping of the promise eventually took. The family waiting for Elijah had a picture. The rough man from Gilead, the one who had been taken up in the whirlwind, the one for whom the place was set and the cup was poured. When the door was opened at Passover, the picture in the mind of the child watching was probably not a man in camel's hair, eating locusts in a wilderness 60 miles away. And this is perhaps the most important thing those 400 years required of the people who survived them with their faith intact. The willingness to be surprised by the form the answer takes. Not the faith that specifies in advance exactly how the promise will be kept and then waits to verify the specification, but the faith that holds the promise itself, the core of it, the thing underneath all the specific details, and stays genuinely open to the possibility that the God who made it is not limited to the forms the human imagination has prepared for. The cup was poured for Elijah, and what came was a man named John. But the hearts were turned. The way was prepared. The promise was kept. It just did not look the way the picture in the mind of the child at the table had looked. That is what it costs to keep the cup on the table for 400 years. Not certainty. Not a detailed roadmap of exactly how and when and in what form the promise will be fulfilled. Just the willingness to pour the wine and open the door and look honestly into the dark and close it again and say, to the child watching, not yet, and mean it as a promise rather than a defeat. The morning is coming. Pour the cup. Open the door. And when it comes, do not be so committed to the picture you had prepared that you miss what is actually standing in the doorway.
Chapter 10. The Last Word and the Morning that Followed It. After Malachi spoke, the world waited. We began there, and we return there now. But the sentence means something different at the end of this journey than it did at the beginning, because now you know what the waiting looked like from the inside. You have sat with the exhausted community, asking, "How have you loved us?" You have heard the priests going through motions that had become hollow. You have felt the slow erosion of faithfulness in the ordinary spaces of daily life. You have sat with the woman by the lamp and her stone of quiet exhaustion. You have seen the book of remembrance and the family at the Passover table and the 400 years of doors opened into darkness. And now we come to the question that all of this has been moving toward. What does a story like this mean for the person listening to it tonight? Not in the abstract. In the specific, in the particular circumstance of your actual life, in this actual night, in whatever you brought with you into these quiet hours that made sleep feel like something to be reached rather than simply received. Malachi was not writing theology for its own sake. He was writing for people who were tired, people who had tried, people who were asking whether the trying was worth it and whether anyone was paying attention and whether the gap between the promise and the reality they were living in was ever going to close. He was writing for you, not because your circumstances are identical to those of a small Jewish community in the 5th century before Christ, but because the question underneath those circumstances is the same question that has not changed across 2,500 years of human history. Is anyone there? Does this matter? Is the faithfulness worth it? And Malachi's answer, carried across all of that time, is the same answer it was when he first spoke it. Yes, I have loved you. You are not abandoned. You are not the last one. You are written down. And the morning is coming. I want to come to the end of this night by speaking honestly about what that morning looked like when it finally arrived. Not because the story requires a tidy resolution, but because the people who poured the cup for 400 years deserve to have someone say clearly what happened when the door was finally opened and the promise was finally kept. John came to the wilderness. He wore camel's hair and a leather belt. He called the people to prepare. He baptized in the Jordan River. And one day a man from Galilee came to the river, and when John saw him, he said something that the tradition has never forgotten. Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. Shortly after that, a voice came from heaven, and the voice said, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Christians came to understand this moment as the beginning of the fulfillment of everything the prophetic tradition had been pointing toward. Not only Malachi, all of it. The Exodus and the covenant at Sinai, and the Psalms of David, and the visions of Isaiah, and the lamentations of Jeremiah, and the 6 disputes of Malachi. All of it moving, across centuries, toward a moment when the word that had been speaking through all of those voices became, in the way that the Gospel of John would later describe it, flesh, moved into the neighborhood, sat at tables, asked questions, told stories, reached toward people who had been told they were unreachable, called people beloved who had spent years wondering whether anyone remembered their name. Beloved. I want to hold that word at the end of this long night because it is the word that the entire tradition had been trying to say in every dispute and every vision and every lament and every promise across all of those centuries. You are beloved. Not, you are useful. Not, you are compliant. Not, you have met the standard and earned the designation. Beloved. The word for the person you would not trade away for anything. The word for the one whose name is written in the book, not because of what they have done, but because of who they are, to the one keeping the record. Malachi opened his book with the words, I have loved you. And 400 years of silence later, the voice from heaven opened the new chapter with the word, beloved. The love had not changed, only the silence between the two declarations. Now I want to speak directly to you, wherever you are on this particular night. You may have come to this story as someone outside the tradition it emerges from. Someone who found it by accident or curiosity, or because something in the opening sentences pulled you in on a night when sleep would not come. What I want you to know is this. The questions Malachi is asking are not questions that belong exclusively to any religious tradition. The gap he describes is the gap that every human being who has ever tried to believe in something larger than themselves has felt. The aching distance between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. Between the love that is promised and the love that can be felt. Between the silence and the word that finally breaks it. You are allowed to want the morning. And wanting it is not weakness or naivety or the sign of someone who has not thought carefully enough. It is the most honest thing a person can do. You may have come to this story as someone who has been in the tradition for a long time and is going through a season of silence. A season where the faith is still present, but the feeling is not. Where you are still at the table, but the cup feels more like habit than hope. Where you have opened the door more times than you can count, and the lane outside has been dark every single time. What I want you to know is this. You are not alone in that season. The woman by the lamp was not alone. The family at the Passover table was not alone. The generations who kept the cup on the table through Persian governance and Greek cultural pressure and Roman occupation were not alone. They were all written in the same book. They were all held as the same treasured possession. And so are you. Your season is not the whole story. And if you have come to this night carrying something specific, something with weight and shape, and a name you may not have said out loud to anyone, something that has made the quiet feel heavy instead of restful, what I want you to leave with is the simplest thing Malachi has to offer. You are not forgotten. You are not abandoned. Whatever you are holding tonight is known by the one who keeps the book of remembrance. The cup on your table has not gone unnoticed. The door you have opened more times than you can count, looking for something that has not yet appeared in the form you expected. That faithfulness is written down. The sun of righteousness is rising. Christians who have read Malachi across the centuries have seen in that image a hope fulfilled in ways that the original community could not have anticipated, fulfilled through the one whose arrival broke the silence, and whose voice the tradition had been preparing to hear for a very long time. The healing that the long night made necessary, the warmth that comes not because the night was not real or the waiting was not long, but because the morning is proportional to the dark that preceded it. You are not the last one. You are beloved. And the morning, wherever you are in the long arc between the last word and the first light, is already on its way to find you. It does not hurry. It does not delay. It comes at the time appointed, the way all mornings come, quietly and without announcement, finding you exactly where you are, warming what has gone cold, healing what the night has marked. The last prophet of the Old Testament has spoken his last word. The silence that followed was long, but the morning that broke on the other side of it changed everything, and that morning is still breaking. Even now, even here, even in this room, in this night, in the quiet that is settling over these words as they find the place in you where the real things live. The darkness has not overcome the light. Not once. Not in 3,000 years. Not tonight. Good night, beloved. The cup is on the table. The door is open. And the morning is already on its way to find you.